incredibly important for LPs in particular to think about when they're looking at it in relationship with a venture capital firm. Because as an LP, returns are not asymmetric enough to be worth investing in one fund. So as LPs, we are looking truly to build a relationship, not just because that sounds nice and we're human beings, but because the benefit of investing in a firm will accrue over multiple funds. Whereas a VC might invest in a founder only one time, and that can justify the entirety of that relationship. They don't have to invest in any of the other founders' follow-up startups, right? So it is a different mentality. So then the question of succession then bears more relevance, because that is how you get from, maybe not from fund 1 to fund 3, but certainly from 1 to fund 5, succession starts to matter more.
Superclusters is the podcast that demystifies the secrets, stories, and tactics behind the money that moves the venture capital world. Ben Choi is the managing director at Next Legacy Partners, a fund of funds dedicated to harnessing the power of venture capital for positive change. Also a recent marriage between two incredible juggernauts in this space, Legacy Venture and Next Play Capital. Legacy also boasts a portfolio including the likes of Andreessen Horowitz, Excel Partners, and Index Ventures. And Legacy has also been dubbed, Silicon Valley's VC fund for charities, a mission that has stayed its course even past the aforementioned merger. And oh boy, I promise you, we're going to get into that later in this conversation. Ben himself has put on multiple hats, from being an operator to a founder to VC to now LP. And that, my friends, is the royal flush of royal flushes. And I can only imagine all those lived-in experiences helps you better appreciate all the nuances in each segment of the broader innovation industry, and which we'll also cover at some point in this conversation. And while I could read your whole Rolodex of experiences, Ben, it will not do your career justice. So instead, I'll include them all in the show notes so we can get straight into, borrowing my favorite term back from grade school, the meaty stuff. So the goal of today is not just to, highlight your work at Next Legacy, but also the human sitting across from me today. So I'm going to make a lot of promises to our audience, and I'm going to do my best to strike a balance between fulfilling them and living under the mortgage of my promises. Additionally, if I had $1 for every single time in the past couple of weeks, even in the past year, someone tells me you have to chat with Ben Choi, I'd be a freaking millionaire. So today, Ben, I'm glad to have you on season 1.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this, dude.
We could start in a million places, and every podcast or host would probably start in a different place. But for today, I'd like to start from a great James Clear line that I absolutely adore, which is almost every idea is downstream of what you consume. So for you, Ben, from working the holiday shift at Banana Republic to working to get your security clearance at the CIA to supporting your brother in his efforts to support the people of Haiti, was there a chapter in your early career that disproportionately shaped your ethos as an investor today?
Your level of background prep is just stunning. Thank you. Those things are all true. I think it comes back to my parents as immigrants, and so many things that I didn't even appreciate about their own upbringing and their own pre-parent life. Like we know our parents as just mom and dad growing up, and it's only like when we're adults we realize, oh, they had a whole life before kids, just like I have a whole life before my kids. And so much of that actually has bearing on the way I think about life, both personal and professional today. And a lot of it has to do with just working hard and being high integrity and being true to your word and caring for the people around you. And lots of little lessons and things. My parents were not ones to sit me down and teach me those things with nice James Clear quotes, but it was really just by life and observing how they prioritized family, work, all those things. I think that's probably the most seminal part of how I operate today, is I look back on my parents.
Was there an age for you, Ben, in your younger years where you started noticing the actions of your parents a lot more than your previous years?
I'm the youngest of 3 boys. There's a 4-year gap between my middle brother and myself. And so by high school, they were off to college on the East Coast. I grew up in the Bay Area. And so I think high school, like the family dynamics changed dramatically because there was only one boy left. It went from a very busy house to just me. And so I think there was a lot more space for me. I probably there's a lot more space for my parents just to do things besides minding three boys. But there's also space for me and also just maturity for me to see them doing things. They were we had moved to the Bay Area when I was young, and they were they ran a small private medical practice, a doctor and nurse, and they they worked a lot, but they set up their office right on the border of the financial district in Chinatown to serve the Chinatown population. And so I got to see I knew that all the time growing up, but I got to see more of it once I was in high school and kind of just was more aware of the work they were doing, but also kind of why and their motivation for the work they were doing.
That makes a lot of sense. Going from three cantankerous, crazy boys to one, you all of a sudden had all the attention in the world.
I also have three boys now, and two of our two older boys are off to camp for 3 weeks for the first time right now. And so my wife and I have been observing that our youngest, who is 6 right now, and us, we're experiencing a little mini chapter of what I remember my high school experience to be.
20 years into the future, when I go ask the same question to your youngest, I imagine there'll be some similar, connotations going on. It's like, hey, it's after my two older brothers, which I believe are twins, ended up,
my two oldest sons are twins. Yep.
Right. And so I imagine all of a sudden they're like, I have all this attention. Summer may be the best or may be the worst, because before I could do all these crazy things, and now parents are watching me like a hawk 24/7.
6-year-old, it's all goodness. Everything's goodness. It's a 6-year-old.
Everything is goodness.
I hope.
That's true. A 6-year-old has not been polluted by the motivations of older individuals. That's fascinating. And so going in the theme of mentorship, and kind of like, how you looked up to your parents, and this is going off script a little bit, but I couldn't help but ask this, but you've reached mastery in a lot of different areas, from building as an operator and growing your business as an entrepreneur, and to, betting on incredible companies. And if I set the record straight here, but like, I believe Marketo, CourseHero, Massive, just to name a few. So I have to ask, whereas most people have one or two mentors for a specific vertical where they spend an inordinate amount of time of their life in, are there people you consider to be mentors across each and all of these other disciplines as well?
There are so many people who either were my managers or people who hired me, gave me a shot in the business, who had so much influence and gave me an opportunity, also gave me tidbits of advice along the way. I had the fortune and misfortune of changing jobs a lot early in my career. Early being most of my career up until Next Legacy Partners. So there isn't like one arc of a mentor who guided me through many chapters. I was actually we had a family gathering. We take an annual vacation with friends from college every summer. We've done this for a decade now, roughly. And some of the oldest kids now are in college. And so this is the first year we sat down, and several of the kids had asked, like, could we talk to some of the aunties and uncles about like work and what you do? And so all the aunties and uncles took turns, and I had my turn, and I was trying to think about like mentorship and like how did I learn stuff? And I didn't appreciate enough probably along the way all that people were pouring into me and the opportunities they were giving me. But what I thought about for myself was, there's some people who go really deep and can get really good at one thing. I think one of my superpowers or talents is that I can get mediocre really fast, but it's mediocre. I'm not an expert at many things, but I can get mediocre really fast. And so I can have like a reasonable conversation with a lot of different kinds of people on a broad range of topics, which served well in sort of the different things I've done in my career. But that was like, I figured out a way to use that talent to work for me in my career, as opposed to, several of the parents were doctors or lawyers who had like gone down a deep professional path for many, many, many years and kind of been doing that one thing. And that's like, it's so special what they've done professionally. but that's just not my story. So and that ties to the mentorship thing, because since I haven't had one organization I've worked for, or even one industry, I haven't had the benefit of one person who could kind of guide me through all that. I had to sort of figure my way through it.
That makes a lot of sense. And in kind of, could you walk me through, and like I would love the insider's peek for Ben's mind over here. When you say you can get to mediocrity much faster, what does that mean? Like what are the steps in which you take to go from nothing to the middle 50%?
My background is product. So my mind always goes to how things work. So I like to understand businesses, products, organizations, and even people, like based on like what's making them tick, or what's making the thing work, what's at the core of it. And if that's relevant to the thing, then I'm able to get there pretty quickly in terms of basic understanding. It doesn't make me an expert, but it allows me to kind of get a basic framework for how this thing works, and then I can expand that into I can extrapolate quickly from there.
Gotcha. And for those, and I imagine a good proportion of our audience, including myself, do not have product backgrounds, right? How, and let me know if this hits a dead end, and I'll take full responsibility of this, but how do you, embark on this product oriented mindset? Like, how does your brain work? If we could take an example per se, like when you first jumped into the world of, I don't know, InQtel, for example, right? Or when you're part of the Kauffman Fellows, how did you apply the product mindset to that?
Well, actually, I'll use even just what we're doing right now. You mentioned this is my first time being on a Riverside, using Riverside as a tool for this podcast, and you described it. I think you described it really well. Like some people might say, "Oh, it's a tool for podcasting," but you said it's different from Zoom because it records everything locally, and then you can that way you don't have the issues with bandwidth. That's like a product insight into what this thing is. If you just understood it from the top level of, oh, it's for podcasting, and you didn't understand a little bit of like the mechanics behind it, then it's hard. It's sort of you have to be told what else it can do, or what the implications would be for this product or this business. But like that little bit understanding a little bit behind the scenes, one more level of like, what, all right, it does video, I get it, but that's just like Zoom. What actually is different about this? That's to me that's like the product mindset, trying to understand what are the mechanics behind this thing, not just for that itself, but then you can, if you understand the mechanics a bit, you can understand what else this thing could do, or what else it might do in the future.
That makes sense. It's I almost might call it like first principles thinking, right?
Yeah.
You start from like, here are two products. Why are they different? What makes them different? And I believe it's, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's Simon Sinek who says like start with why. Where you start with the why, then the how, then the what. And so many people, going back to the Riverside example, right? They start with the what. They go like, this is what it is. It's meant for podcasts. It's a podcasting platform, but they don't go back to the how. And, the example you just mentioned is like, hey, it preserves the fidelity of video and audio locally, which is different from Zoom for Riverside. And, I'm gonna be honest, if Riverside wants to sponsor this podcast, this is a great promotion for them. It's a free promotion for them already. But that's the how. And then eventually, like the product mindset would you'd go and retrace your steps back to the why. Like, why is someone doing this? And it reminds me a lot of, I think Josh Wolf once said this. This was put on like a Twitter thread somewhere. I'll probably go find it, but it exists somewhere on the interwebs, where he talked about the difference between intentions and incentives, right? The intentions are what you embark on the journey with. Like, when you, create nuclear energy, for example, right? The whole goal is to create renewable energy for the world that is independent of all these other sources and all these like polluting materials, right? But the incentives, once you realize how powerful it is, we've seen the after effects of what most people align with the word nuclear, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I imagine. And let me know if I'm like going on my own horse and have gone in the entirely separate direction, but that's what I imagine it to be like.
Well, I'll bring that even more tangential. That the whole cool world that we get to operate in, this tech startup ecosystem, there are a lot of governments around the world who've looked at Silicon Valley or the broader, U.S. tech ecosystem and said, "I want one. We need that. We need that engine." And there's a good intention there, but without the right incentives, and lots of other things. But the incentives are a really important part of it. And I think the venture capital, LP, founder, that part of the equation of Silicon Valley as shorthand for tech in the U.S. I think it's a non-trivial part of what makes this whole thing work, and it's incentives. It's the opportunity for a founder to create immense value and have the motivation because they're an equity owner, and then for a VC to be able to partner with those founders and generate returns through carry, and then for an LP to be part of those returns. So all those incentives, I think, are kind of what create that ecosystem. And there's so many governments I've seen around the world try to let's make one of the Silicon Valleys, but they're not able to create the same incentive structure because it's complicated. Like there's lots of different parties involved.
Absolutely. And in an earlier episode with Chris, one of the things about innovation in California is that, and I think I've cited this before as well, but Chris is great at this, but California is one of the few states where you cannot enforce non-compete agreements. So in terms of incentives to build in California, there's a lot more incentive to build innovation here. So Ben, you kind of teed it up really nicely. I don't know if you're mind reading or anything, but I am curious about because you've been all the constituents in the innovation ecosystem, right? You've been an operator, you've been a founder, you've been a VC, you've been an LP, you're now an LP. I'm curious, what are aspects of being a VC that most founders fail to appreciate? And on the flip side, what are aspects of being an LP that do most VCs and GPs fail to appreciate?
First one is, what are aspects of being a VC that founders appreciate?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, because if you understand the incentives and motivations of the person across the table, then you're going to be able to connect and also find the common value opportunity. So I think a lot of founders don't really understand the venture business. So that I think that the most common thing is they don't appreciate how a VC makes money. VCs make money as a percentage of the returns, right? 20% roughly of the returns, but returns on the fund, not on the individual investment. And there's a lot of risk with these investments. And so if one company does really well, that VC doesn't make a percentage of the profits of that one return. It's of all of the investments, many of which failed within that fund, and that partner probably has other partners who made investments as well. Just understanding that math, that drives a VC to have multiple investments. They don't benefit the same way the founder does from that one company. And there can be a tension between founders and VCs where founders feel like they're doing all the work, which they are for that company. They are creating all the value for that company. The VC has supplied capital and other resources and connections, but is motivated through their incentives to have a portfolio of those companies, and has to actually balance not just the money. The money goes in first, but then afterwards, time and attention and resources of the firm get allocated. And realistically, they should be allocated to the companies who have the most potential to create more value with that. So sometimes they've got to triage their portfolio. That's the incentives of the venture business. Same question applied VCs to LPs. Certainly, especially for first time or early VCs, or even now, for the last 5 years, raising capital from LPs has been very different than I think it will be for the next 10 years. We're going back to, I think, what it used to be like. There's been just a flood of LPs trying to get in. And so I think a lot of managers, GPs who raised capital from LPs only in the last 5 years sort of learned a pattern, understandably, because that was the pattern at the time of just got to find a bunch of people who are looking for venture. And if I say I do venture, then do it enough times and you'll find people will just give you money. There's just an oversupply of LP capital and not enough firms, even though so many firms started. I don't think that's that was a certain time in the market that's probably not going to generate the best returns overall for the venture industry. I think there are different kinds of LPs out there looking for different things, but there are far fewer LPs in general today who are just looking for venture like they did for the last, like many did for the last 5 years. And so I think as if GPs appreciate that, then the conversations you're going to have, the people that you'll actually speak to as potential investors, potential LPs, is just going to be a different quality of conversation, a cadence of conversation than it has been for the last 5 years.
That makes sense. And kind of doubling down on that, you taught a great class in the mystical halls of Langley, aptly named the tradecraft of venture capital. And this was, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but 2012, which was pre all this hype, right? The date may be off, but
Oh, yeah, I think it's 2006.
is it 2006? Okay, so it's even
Google.
earlier. At least the article was written in 2012, so I kind of benchmarked it then. But so this is why you can't trust everything you see on the internet. And in your mind today, what has changed and what has held its course in the past 2 decades or so in the venture world, right? You mentioned this past 5 years is more of an anomaly, like when it comes to VCs raising from LPs and otherwise, right? But are we seeing a lot more similar? Are you seeing a lot more similarity from the LP side that's similar to 2006, 2007?
So what's changed in the tradecraft of ventures in the last 20, since 20 years ago, I guess, or
Since 20 years ago.
But yeah. Well, for this audience, as emerging LPs, that conversation with the CIA and kind of presenting to them the tradecraft of venture capital was all about GPs and founders. Like, I don't think I even talked about the idea of where the capital came from. So in that sense, I think that conversation, that presentation would hold up today just as well as it did back then. And it was as interesting for me to think about, okay, what is tradecraft and how would I describe tradecraft in venture capital? Because the work of the CIA is to study tradecraft, is to study the ways and means of any one profession for the purpose of gathering intelligence and influencing people. And so the question was, like, how do we use venture capital, or can we use venture capital to gather intelligence that we could not, that is difficult for us to otherwise gather? And I think it actually is. There is an incredible way for them to do that if they did it. In-Q-Tel wasn't actually that. We were funded by the government, but not directly by the CIA. We didn't report to the CIA. We weren't officially actually, part of the CIA. But we had, I went briefed. We had liaisons, formal liaisons, to share general information, not anything specific. But the idea of, like, venture capital is an information gathering, a signal gathering trade. Like, what a VC does isn't just like sit in a dark room and be a genius and then pick one company. It's like talking to founders, learning from the market, gathering, kind of seeing patterns, learning along the way, and then picking out signal from a lot of noise. And if you think about it that way, actually, that is what intelligence is, right? That's what the CIA's business is. We just happen to do it in a really specific little sector called tech.
And has information gathering, so to speak, I guess in the world of venture we call it diligence, but has that changed? Because I imagine most people who are looking to allocate into venture funds today have, for better or for worse, recognized the patterns, were bred on the patterns of the last 5 years. That's all they knew, right? How should they change their wheelhouse of thinking to better reorient themselves for the next decade?
Well, this has changed from 2005-ish or 6 when I presented that tradecraft of venture capital, because I think there are 3 big parts of the VC's job. It's sourcing, picking, and adding value, right? Helping these companies be successful. And different VCs lean into different parts. We actually often, as an LP, ask GPs which of those is your superpower. You can pick only one, and just get a sense for where they kind of see their differentiation. For the CIA, I think that the 2 that were most relevant were the sourcing and picking, right? How do you see the broad ecosystem, find opportunities, and then how do you do the due diligence? Like, how do you go in deep on one company and, like, ferret out the red flags or the positive signals that are latent inside the data or the people in there. And you think back to 05, 06, I don't know, LinkedIn was maybe 2, 3 years old. Like it wasn't the thing it is today.
Right.
TechCrunch launched as a blog in 06, I think. And there weren't blogs before that. Like if you think about like information on companies, like if you're trying to source today, like there's just so much. So back then you couldn't sit at your desk, at your computer and just read all day long. There wasn't enough material to do that. And there was no Twitter, obviously. Facebook was still only available to, like I was on Facebook because I had a post.harvard.edu address. I had an alumni address, and we kind of got into the back door. But you had to have certain university email addresses, .edu addresses. So like all social media was just getting started 18, 20 years ago. So sourcing looked different because a lot of it was a lot more person to person, which I guess you have potentially a little higher signal to noise ratio, but just a lot less information because you can only have so many conversations. I think today there's so much information available. We are now, I think in the last 2-3 years, really appreciating how, more information isn't inherently better. Now we have the problem of we almost can't trust anything that we see online. Dude, I didn't talk to the CIA in 2012. I talked to them in 2006, right? Like just because it's out there doesn't make it true. And now we have to actually have a whole different, and maybe that shifts from sourcing back then was a really key thing because information was not as available, to then diligence and picking was a thing then, is maybe even more of a thing now. Figuring out, of all the information out there, where's the real signal, and what can I see that the market, my competitors, don't see or don't have access to. There's so much access now. So it's more, do you have some insight that some other people don't have? That's still the same practice, but maybe the insight and picking hasn't changed as much. Maybe it's become just more important because there's so much more information available, and a lot of it false information.
In your world, where do you find the greatest veracity of information? Is it in talking with the GPs themselves? Is it in doing reference calls? And what do you look for in reference calls as well when it comes to these things?
Yeah, to me, there's two kind of broad sources of signal. One is through referrals and relationships and people that I trust. And for me, I build trust over time, and that's one of the things where even though I've changed jobs many times in my career, I've stayed in the same industry and had the benefit and pleasure. Like it's fun for me because I get to spend time with people that I didn't have to work in the same company with them, but over decades have been in the same industry and have just been able to be in a relationship. And that's fun, and there's value and signal that I can gather from there. The other is, I guess what I like to think of as like just integrity of information. Does this actually stand on its own, not because somebody said so, but because the mechanics behind it make sense. And that's kind of that product mindset of, is this systematically internally, does it have internal integrity to it? Does this thing stand up on its own? And that comes from, it might be a stranger that I've just met where I just need to go deeper and hear what they're thinking, what they're doing, who the people around them, and does that all fit, and does it make sense, or is this possibly just kind of thrown together and not yet fully baked?
And to give our audience something a little bit more concrete, what do you mean by a piece of information that can stand on its own? Like, is it a data point? Is it like a number, like a fact? Like, hey, you can't really lie about TVPI or DPI, right? Is it like that, or are you talking about something else?
No, so yeah, let's talk about a VC, and let's say they have a great track record. Awesome, they've got a 10x TVPI, total value paid in investment. So they've 10x capital. Awesome. They're raising a fund right now, and the fund is to do Series A investing. They're going to try to raise a $100 million fund, and they're going to write several $1 million checks. Well, my next question is always, well, tell me about your experience to date. Like, have you been doing Series A investments? Because 10x, that's amazing. That's so cool. How did you get to 10x? What was it that did it? Oh, well, I've invested $100,000 total in 100 companies, $1,000 each, and one of them happened to be Uber. And or if that's the answer, then Well, like that's amazing that you have a 10x, but it doesn't translate to. It's not as relevant to what you're trying to do going forward. So that's what I mean by integrity. If they're suggesting that, well, I've got a 10x and I'm going to keep on doing it, and so my next fund is going to be a 10x because I can do it. I've proven I can do it. If I were them, I wouldn't have that confidence. It doesn't stand on its own, right? It doesn't mean that you can't do it, but the connection, there's a bigger leap there than had they had a 10x on similar dollars, or at least similar stage, if not similar dollars, for the strategy they're saying that the track record is relevant to. That's often kind of the piece when I'm talking to a GP of understanding if they have a track record. They don't always, because if they're emerging managers, but if they do have one, rarely does it tie directly, because usually you're going from some angel or some other firm that's a different scale to something new. So tying the dots of, okay, well, if it doesn't translate directly, what gives you confidence that track record is relevant? And oftentimes the best answers are, I have a 10x actually, but if you just look at the investments that are relevant to the sector I'm focused on, or to the stage, or the kind of founder that I most resonate with, actually my performance is 4x. Oh, well, that's actually still really interesting, and you've actually done it before. You actually have experience, and then the fact that they can actually tell me what sounds like a worse story. Well, it's not 10x, it's just 4x, but actually they have the insight to understand that not all that's relevant. That actually gives me more confidence. That's an example of, totally hypothetical, I'm making this up, but that would be an example of kind of integrity of the information itself.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of something I was chatting with an LP a couple of months back, and the LP was diligencing this like space tech fund, and it was like a $10 million space tech fund, pre-seed seed kind of thing. And one of the things that like totally threw him off, because the quote unquote GP's track record was phenomenal, but they're like, oh yeah, we were like early investors into, and if for our listeners who can't see my air quotes, I just use air quotes. We were early investors into SpaceX, right? And the LP ends up doing diligence on this, and they realize, oh my God, they were part of a syndicate that invested in SpaceX's Series D, and that is not portable in terms of a track record.
Right.
One thing I'm actually really curious about is, when it comes to portability of track record, how much is portable? For example, going back to the example I said earlier, right? $100,000 quote unquote fund size, and they wrote $1,000 checks into 100 companies. What is the size of the fund that makes sense based on that track record? Is it a $5 million fund, $10 million fund? Because I imagine with a $100,000 fund size, they can't just go across and start doing like a $100 million fund, because that is too different from their original fund.
I love the term. I actually never used the word portability. I think it applies to so much in our business. I mean, I don't have a straight answer for you. And there isn't a formula. We don't have a formula internally, and I don't think there are different LPs will have different perspective. Different GPs will have different abilities based on their own personal resources or connections. And sometimes people can raise $100 or $500 million with no track record or very little, and sometimes people with great track records can't raise much. And over the last 5 years, many funds were raised that were much larger than will be raised going forward for the next 5 years, probably. And that has less to do with the quality of the GPs, has more to do with the nature of the LP supply of capital. And so actually understanding that and not trying to overly learn lessons from the last 5 years of what's the magic formula that equates dollars out from LPs is probably the more important thing. But I think it applies also to GPs when they think about portability of experience. Like, do you back, if somebody started $1 billion unicorn business, how portable is that experience to the next company that they start? I think the GPs have to ask that question all the time. And there's some firms that specialize in repeat founders, and other firms that actually avoid that because of the pricing dynamics, and like have an incredible talent for finding first-time founders who can create these companies. So I think the question applies all up and down the stack of our little world of venture.
There's not a hard and fast rule, and as you mentioned, like LPs have different, like at least implicit rules. I don't want to call it rules, but implicit like biases altogether. Like for
Yep.
one LP, it might be, hey, you used to have an angel track record where you invested $100,000, $25 million of a fund makes sense because you're still a participating investor. You're not like taking your ownership is not what you're necessarily looking for because you're just trying to like get in on the best deals. But
Mm-hmm.
when you start raising, and feel free to correct me here because you have a lot more experience here than I do, but as you start raising, let's say a $50-100 million fund, you start being able to lead rounds. And if you can lead rounds, it's very different from writing $1,000 check because that's a different strategy altogether.
Totally. Yeah. The move from participating in syndicates to leading rounds is a significant strategic shift for a GP. It's a different strategy. It's a different role in the ecosystem. And first, GPs need to understand that. It's for me, when GPs don't kind of gloss over that detail, and as they're increasing fund size or increasing check size, oftentimes they expect to increase check size, particularly over the last 5 years where capital is so available. Oh, I've got all this demand from my existing LPs. You might be so lucky as to invest in me. I'm going to double or triple my fund size. And so I'm just going to double triple my check size too. And oftentimes if that tips them from logical syndicate partners who logical lead, I'll ask, so what experience do you have leading? What evidence do you have for yourself that the companies that you want to invest in will take you as a lead investor versus the other options? And sometimes there's some GPs who don't even realize that dynamic is there because they've never been in that position to be the lead. That's like, okay, let's say, well, take some time, you enjoy that process, and then come back and let's have a conversation. There's one thing, so that's an example of where we might hold off on a relationship. But there is a way to do that transition. It's just non-trivial. You can't just like, oh, it just happens automatically and there's no difference.
They can't gloss it over because it's a fundamental strategy shift altogether.
Right.
I'm curious, and feel free to not name any names here, but is there like an example of someone who switched from a participating investor, a non-lead investor to a lead investor, and how do they articulate how they went through that transition?
Most of our relationships are with lead investors. So I'm trying to think if any of them started as more passive. I don't have a good example. I'll come back to it if something comes to mind.
Okay.
I'd be more careful if you're going to name a firm.
No, we're not naming any names. Like we'll have to go through all the compliance things and all that, and I hope our listeners can also understand that there are only so many things we can share in this LP world.
I'll give you an example of one without naming the name. A successful tech executive who had done angel investing, which is an archetype of GPs, was starting a fund that we decided to invest in the first fund in. So example of a fund one that we did. They had not been the lead investor in most of the deals they had done, but they had written checks that were sizable, relative, actually full size syndicate checks. They weren't 100,000 or 10,000. They were millions of dollar checks into back then what were called Series A deals, and now would be called seed stage deals. So they were, but the strategy that they were raising the fund for was to lead. So there was a disconnect between the experience, not as much as normal because the check size they had written personally was big. But one of the mitigating circumstances, one of the things like pieces of signal that we gathered in the data was that even though they weren't necessarily the lead investor pricing the round, pulling the syndicate together, more than once, because of their experience in the industry and the value add that they brought, they often were an independent board member on those companies, even though they weren't the lead investor of that round. And that gave us some sense of, that's the other end of the spectrum of they were part of a syndicate in SpaceX's Series D, right? They were invested early at the round that they want, at the stage they want to invest in now. They weren't the lead investor, but they had the relationship with the founder. The founder chose them even without their money, right? And that's actually maybe even a harder bar for many GPs. Like, would that founder actually want you on your board if you weren't leading their round, if you didn't have the money, you didn't have the capital? So that gave us a sense. Well, okay, if they're desirable as an independent at that stage, then they have probably the capability to win the right to lead those rounds also.
And it's about drawing on their past experiences and seeing if you can thread together, if you can connect the dots to where they want to go. And sorry, and if you can't thread the needle between all those previous data points to where they want to go, or there's a disconnect there, it's just much harder for that to back this new strategy that seems to be more or less out of the blue.
That's right. Okay, to extend that analogy into the previous part of our conversation about integrity, like, does it hang together? If you see a thread and you pull it, does it just come out as a single little piece of thread? Like, there's no integrity there. Then if you pull it and and the whole fabric starts to warp, like the whole thing starts to, like, as you pull it, other pieces start to move. Oh, there's connections. Like things. This thing makes sense as a thing. That thread actually is holding this together.
That's a great analogy. I mean, like,
Your analogy.
I mean, like, I didn't say that with that intention, but I immediately started conceptualizing my old T-shirts that I've worn since college. And as I start pulling the thread, the sleeves come off, the logos start coming off, and I'm like, oh my God, like, that was a very important piece of thread.
Those are the best T-shirts. Those are the softest ones.
I know, which makes me even more sad because the less nice shirts, so to speak, right? The career fair T-shirts and all, they're independent threads. And I don't know how far we can pull this analogy because at some point all analogies start breaking apart. But I dig it. I dig it.
I still have some career fair T-shirts in my drawer that I probably have to let go of at some point. But 29 years since my freshman year, I have at least one still that are treasured possessions.
Is there, okay, this is going completely off script and we might just edit all this out together, but this is too good of a itch not for me to scratch. Is there a reason of that one shirt that you do have why it still stays in your drawer? Is there like a memento or like a memory that is associated with that?
Well, we were earlier talking about it may be an Asian immigrant thing, child of immigrants, but free T-shirts was like that was the best. That was the pinnacle of sales shopping as a college student. So there's certainly that, and that's the bulk of what I wore in college. The ones that I have, they were associated with either an organization that I was, I spent my time with, or just looked kind of cool to me, which I'm sure is extremely dorky and looked very terrible. But yeah.
I don't fault you for that.
I'm thinking through the ones that are at the bottom of my drawer now. I'm going to go back and look at my T-shirts.
I mean, they still carry some kind of memory. I don't fault you for that because I had this saying back in college, for better, for worse. I said, if it's for free, it's for me. And so I would just go to, and I kid you not, and this is really side-railing the conversation, but hackathons had the best free swag out there because the folks who are technical, like, they cost the most, and companies got to woo them in order to get them, right? And so you'd have like YouTube net pillows and like Netflix kind of like selfie sticks, and you'd have like onesies and like body pillows and all these kind of things from these larger tech companies. And I would just collect them all. I was freaking Ash Ketchum. I was catching them all. Okay.
Wait, one more, and you edit all this out. I remember in that same mentality of like T-shirts, I think extended to my early tech career, where early YC demo days, like back when it was like 20 VCs in the room, like in the first few classes, like 20 years ago, some of the teams would come in a single color T-shirt with a company logo on it, and it was like so cool. Like they like, oh my goodness, they're a real company. Because like nobody does that. Nobody gets a T-shirt with a logo on it 6 weeks into their company. It was the coolest thing. They didn't give those T-shirts out for free because they were, they only had a couple $1,000s from YC. But I remember like there was an association, probably because like, free T-shirts was such an important thing to me in college. Now, like every single, like that's the uniform. You get on stage with your single color T-shirt with your logo. But back in the day, not all of them did it. It wasn't so easy to do. I don't know. People, it just wasn't the thing you did. But I remember the few that did it, it was very notable, and like, I don't know, probably had too much signal for me than I should have had.
I mean, it was unique then, but what was unique then is no longer unique now. Now it's commonplace, right? Is there anything that founders or venture firms do today that stand out to you? Like, it's probably no longer the free T-shirts. Are there anything else that you've seen? Like, oh, this could be a trend in the next 10 years.
One of the things that stands out, there's a GP who we were just getting to know for the first time, and really made an impression on me. We spent this is 5 years ago. They were talking crypto, and it was kind of just before crypto was kind of mainstream. I was not an early crypto person. I was learning about it at the time. And they spent we literally asked the stupidest questions. So what is this Bitcoin thing? Like, can you explain how it works? But with a product mindset, can you? And so we had an hour, we had an hour and a half meeting. An hour of it was on this Ethereum Bitcoin stuff and like, how does it work, and explain the blockchain to me and all that stuff. And it was off script. It wasn't their presentation. And they just talked about it for an hour and talked about what was interesting to them and some of the investments they made and why they thought it was interesting. And at the end of that conversation, I remember asking and saying, okay, so this is so interesting. Lots of stuff about the firm you're going to start is interesting. Like, should we assume that you're a crypto fund, which wasn't a thing yet? Like, are you going to invest in crypto as your main thing? And what really surprised me and really compelled me to build conviction to invest with this GP was, they said, oh no, that'd be crazy. Like, maybe we'll do a third of our fund into crypto stuff. But that's just one example of something that we're really passionate and interested in. We're deep in it. We're in the network of entrepreneurs. We think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and we're going to do a few investments. And then there's these other three things that we're equally interested in. And to me, that's that transition from a founder has to be super deep in one thing, and that has to be their life's passion. A GP needs to be able to swim in that pool, but also in this one over here, and build a portfolio across a bunch of different things. So that was showing that depth, and then showing the ability to step back from it and understand the portfolio level view of building a successful franchise.
I have a friend who once told me that the more you abstract yourself, the more degrees of freedom you are from being a founder, so founder to VC to LP, the more generalist you end up becoming. And that's really important from being a specialist to eventually an expert generalist, right? You are very keen on a few areas, and then at some point you're like, hey, how does this fit in the larger portfolio? How does this make sure I give the folks who invested us back some money? Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit over here.
Yeah.
And one thing I've been very, very curious about, and my career lifespan, I'm still an adolescent. So I still haven't seen a wide variety of this, but it's about the topic of succession planning. And you were on a panel in 2019. So this is right before the pandemic. And you talked about how VCs should think about succession planning. And so for those who have not had the chance to grace the halls of the Stanford Law School in March 2019, how early would you recommend emerging managers, like fund ones, fund twos, maybe fund threes, to start thinking about their heir to the throne, right? And if our audience of listeners, a number of which who are LPs and deeply fascinated by the topic as well, how would you recommend LPs approach this topic with GPs?
I think it's incredibly important for LPs in particular to think about when they're looking at it and in relationship with a venture capital firm. Because as an LP, the returns are not asymmetric enough to be worth investing in one fund. So as LPs, we are looking truly to build a relationship, not just because that sounds nice and we're human beings, but because the benefit of investing in a firm will accrue over multiple funds. Whereas a VC might invest in a founder only one time, and that can justify the entirety of that relationship. They don't have to invest in any of the other founders' follow-up startups, right? So it is a different mentality. And so then the question of succession then it bears more relevance, because that is how you get from maybe not from fund one to fund three, but certainly from one to fund five, succession starts to matter more. So on fund one, it's kind of early to talk about succession, but the cousin of succession is just what is your motivation as a GP? And those motivations can change in some ways. You can't really understand what kind of parent you're going to be until you are a parent. You can't really understand what kind of GP you're going to be until you are a GP, until you're starting, investing in the fund. But you could have a thesis that somebody's going to be a solo capitalist or a small partnership that doesn't continue past 3 or 4 funds. And that could make sense for an LP. Okay, we're going to invest for a couple funds, and you're not trying to build an enduring thing. The primary consideration early on is, will this partnership actually last the next 3 funds? Forget succession and who the next GPs are. One of the largest risks we bear as LPs is, does this thing blow up? Do we believe these partners not only will be successful, but can they actually avoid failure? Can they avoid going their own ways? Not because, either because they're problems, human being problems, or because they just don't see eye to eye and they weren't thoughtful enough kind of putting the whole thing together. So I think that's the first questions for emerging managers getting into new partnerships. As they get further along, succession starts to matter more. And I do think it's important to say that succession and long-term generational firms aren't inherently better. Isn't inherently the right answer for all firms, right? Some firms should just wind up, and it'd be better to have that integrity of understanding the motivations of the GPs and wind it up, or allow some subset to move forward without others. And that's super difficult. Like, it's what my partner has a fun phrase. He says there's more politics per partner in a venture capital organization than any other human organization. The politics of making a venture capital partnership work are complicated for lots of good reasons. And so as an LP, that's a primary area of diligence and understanding, and having a thesis on, will I have the opportunity to invest in the next few funds? If it's fund 1, then it's probably going to blow up. If it's fund 5 through fund 7, that's probably oftentimes a transition point, a succession point. Do they have the same right motivations? Do they have the right talent? Do they have the right ability to share economics so that talent stays motivated and actually potentially leads the firm going forward?
Are there examples, to kind of double click on that, are there examples of fund 5s through fund 7s on what they did to keep their future talent or their talent motivated to take on the reins for the next generation? You mentioned compensation. It could be in the form of carry. It could be in the form of, actually, I don't even know what else, but like what are examples or things that you've seen where I guess like current GPs have done to motivate the next generation of talent to stay at the firm?
Yeah, it's leadership and it's internal leadership within the firm. It's the opportunity to invest at all, like for junior going forward. And there isn't a right answer to that, right? So that LPs, we may not want a bunch of junior venture investors investing our capital. We actually may have only conviction to invest in the existing GPs. Like that's why the right answer is not necessarily that they should have succession, but just to have have integrity about whether or not succession makes sense, and if they want it to happen, are they going to be successful? Ultimately, it's rarely, I think, this person versus this person. It's usually a question of, are their economics, have the senior or established general partners, are they willing to share enough of the overall pie with the rising talent for them to A, have the opportunity to invest, and B, have the opportunity to feel like they're going to benefit from either their own work or being part of that partnership. And it's very natural and reasonable for established GPs to hold on to the economics for themselves. And those are situations where succession is more difficult. It's not impossible. It's more difficult. You'll have a different kind. You're certainly going to have a different kind of talent, because that talent who stays and is motivated isn't motivated by carried interest economics, or at least not current ones. It's probably future economics.
Are there qualitative things that GPs can do to motivate kind of like talent? It could be the equivalent of, like, I imagine, like if you're at a startup, you want, your first engineer to rise with you all the way to become like, the VP of engineering or like the CTO one day, right? But that you would, at least in a startup, you would pitch them on the vision, right? This is the vision of where this company is going to go. Is there the equivalent of that in the world of venture when everything is so economically driven?
I think the vision, there are some firms that I think actually are building something different. So there's a compelling vision. Certainly, we had the good fortune of investing in Andreessen's first fund when Mark and Ben just got first started, and they had like a very specific vision for what they wanted to build that was different. That's pretty rare, though. Most of venture is, and they actually shifted the model for most firms, actually. So a lot of firms have copied them over time, and adopted some of their practices. But most firms are collections of a small group of partners with a lot of people around them sometimes, but who are making a handful of investment decisions. They're pretty small businesses, actually. And so, like most small businesses, it isn't necessarily some grand vision of doing something different. It might be the vision of being the best in the industry and competing to be the best, but it also can be really about the relationships and the opportunity that happens to be there. And so much of that is circumstantial. Like, did you happen to get that junior job, and does that firm happen to need you to be successful, or do they need you to actually just do that job and stay there and then move on? Like, there are many firms where the junior investors move on, and that's part of the model and not a reflection of any kind of failure for the junior investors. In the same way, sometimes there's junior investors who get promoted, particularly over the last 5 years, where the venture firms needed them to deploy capital with more and more larger and larger funds, where their success actually was not to take anything away from them, but there was increased opportunity, right? And they happened to be there in these small businesses that needed them. And I think that's understanding that both of those patterns can be possible for people who are hardworking, not hardworking, talented, not talented, and the outcomes are not 100% correlated with those things.
There's no one size that fits all. So I'd be remiss not to talk about Next Legacy, because I'm sure that's the elephant in the room. And so Legacy Venture was founded in 1999, which was .com era, all that kind of stuff. And it was founded on the model that you take 0.7% management fees and no carry. Before we even get to the Next Legacy portion of this, and I don't know how much of this, using the word portability, how much is portable over to Next Legacy, but do you know the story and the history behind Legacy, how Legacy arrived at that model?
Yeah, the economics and the economic model of Legacy Venture was the logical result of a high integrity idea. And the idea was, how do we unlock the power of venture capital to encourage more philanthropic giving? And we can do that by taking capital and making it more so that those people can give more, but using the allure of venture capital returns to encourage people to actually commit more dollars than they would have in the first place to philanthropy. So both of those things. And that idea, my partner Russ Hall founded Legacy Venture in '99, and got 39 individuals to commit $40 million for our first fund. A lot of money for somebody to decide to give away, but a $40 million fund is a tiny little fund in the world of LPs. So Russ was an entrepreneur and founded this thing. The economics that he came up with was, well, if I'm trying to convince my LPs to invest and give away 100% of what they invested, the principal and the gain. So you put it in one version of the pitch is invest in Legacy Venture, you get nothing back for yourself, right? So with that ethos, the model that made the most sense was, well, the motivation here isn't to for Russ Hall to make a bunch of money for himself and maximize fees and carry on top of that. Like that wouldn't be a fit, and it wouldn't be genuine or authentic. So charge a lower fee than anybody else in the business. There weren't many fund of funds back then, so there wasn't much of business. But over time, there are other fund of funds, and they all charge fees. It makes sense. We charge a lower fee than anybody else because we're not trying to maximize our own personal gain in this. We really want to increase giving through venture investments. And the second was, obviously, don't take a carry, don't take any profit off this thing, because that would just skim off, that would divert some returns from those nonprofits to our pockets. The third piece that we don't talk about publicly that much is that Russ decided, and I've done the same. All of our partners have done the same. We have a GP commitment. We invest alongside of our LPs for alignment, proper alignment, to make sure that we're making wise investments for them. we give away 100% of our GP commitment too to charities that we choose. So we're LPs just like our LPs, and just like all of our LPs, we commit our returns to go to charity as well. So particularly if you're going to do that, then it definitely doesn't make any sense to take to try to maximize your economics on the fees and carry side, because you give away the principal and the returns from our GP commitment. So that was the model that Legacy Venture started on, and it continues today through Next Legacy. We a large portion of our investors are philanthropists still, and we'll talk about the other portion of our community. And they continue to commit. Our last fund was a $475 million fund, so a little bigger than our $40 million first fund, but smaller, kind of not a huge fund, but in the industry. We're not trying to build a large asset management business. We just want to deliver the best venture returns we can to a community who's trying to make a positive change in the world. For Legacy Venture, that was a community of philanthropists, and over time, over 20 years, 24 years now, we've brought together hundreds of these philanthropists. We don't have one Bill Gates who is the anchor for this whole thing. It's lots of small checks, millions of dollars for any one person. So it's a lot to people to be given away. But as an institutional manager of capital, it's very small LPs, and that's one of the key things that Legacy Venture was known for, and we are known for as Next Legacy today, in that we represent more than just ourselves as principals of our business. We stand in front of a large community of people who are doing much more for the world than just what they invest with us. We're a small part of their story, and it's our privilege to be part of their philanthropic story. And that's motivating to GPs and founders who have us as their customers. They love serving that. It's not just one large Ivy League university or a large hospital system. It's a whole collection of philanthropists. I'll bridge over to what Next Legacy is today as the merger of two equals, Legacy Venture and NextPlay Capital. And NextPlay had a similar reputation as it's a fund of funds, venture capital LP, and they invested also on behalf of a community, and they were known both as individuals and as representatives of a really unique community. And that community is primarily athletes and celebrities, most of whom are minorities. And that comes from my partner Ryan Neese, who started NextPlay Capital. He's one of very few Black men in the LP business and the venture capital business, and he's been an extremely successful founder of that business, NextPlay Capital. And what we realized was, to the tech community, to GPs and founders, they saw Legacy Venture and NextPlay Capital actually is very similar, very different. And the similarity was, well, these people aren't just money. They're representing a group of people who have significant influence on the world. And the way they influence are either through capital, which is what philanthropy is, using dollars to fund things, or through cultural influence. And in some way, and oftentimes we hear from philanthropists, if only we could get somebody who could actually mobilize around our efforts, who had influence, then we would. And you hear from people who are trying to raise awareness for certain things or try to shift the narrative on certain things in society. If only we had capital so we saw an opportunity to connect those two parts of the community into one community. Also find the overlap, because many of our athletes and celebrities are highly philanthropic themselves, and so that's the new Next Legacy Partners community. That's a community of athletes, celebrities, and philanthropists trying to make a positive change in the world through our network in venture and tech.
That's awesome. And I don't think I ever get sick of hearing that story, because it's such a powerful, speaking of strong visions and strong missions, it's so, even though I'm not at Next Legacy, I'm motivated from hearing that. And one of the things, and this might be a dumb question, rookie question, but how do you decide where the carry goes? Which, nonprofits go to it? Do the LPs pick? Do you pick? How is that decided? Is that in the LPA per se, or is it a voting system? I don't know. What does that look like?
So, for our core flagship fund, which is investing in the premier venture capital firms, that's the fund that has no carry. All the LPs and GPs we give away to charity. the mechanism for that is each person decides. So we're not a donor education organization. We don't force or encourage or even nobody sells from the stage in our events. But it is a really unique community where nobody paid to be in the room, but everybody there is highly philanthropic and care. They have a very diverse. There's a wide diversity of the types of causes and organizations they support, but they have a shared level of commitment of their own capital to the causes that they support. So while we don't do any of the advising on where they give, there are a lot of examples where there are natural peer relationships that come out of our community, and we describe it as a community. We bring them together for large events once or twice a year, but lots of smaller events where they can spend time together, not pitching anything, but building relationship, building trust, and learning from each other.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, Ben, we are coming up on time, and as all good conversations go, we're going to run out of time before we run out of topics. But I want to come full circle here. So I have two more questions in the theme of, I think some people call it quick fire, some people call it lightning round. I still haven't figured out my name for it yet. But I'm so curious. Okay, so first question, there's a lot of flair and showmanship in the world of venture, right? Yet some of the greatest venture funds ever raised had very simple decks. As someone who's once proposed to his wife from a 20-foot video screen on Orchard Road in Singapore, but also as someone who's raised capital with what Inc. magazine once said was not, and I quote, the slickest presentation and wasn't the best speaker, could you share one unique thing a GP has done to win you over in the past that either impressed you on screen or off?
You need to come with me wherever I go and just be my hype man. I love this. I love it.
Sign me up.
Yeah, for me, and this is for me, it's the GPs who are obviously impressive, but also authentic, who have a self-awareness to know, what makes them successful, and including the luck they've had along the way. That's what really differentiates somebody and makes a big impression on me and makes me want to spend more time with them.
Gotcha. Authenticity goes a long way. And it's hard to come by these days, surprisingly. But I will say, if you have a head above two shoulders, recognizing authenticity is much easier than one might suspect. But you have to be looking for that and not for other things.
Yes.
Okay. Second question. Actually, last question. But most people in the LP landscape, including yourself, tend to have a great resume. You've been at Storm, you've been at Mavron, you've been at InQtel, you've started your own businesses, which got acquired. You're an LP now at Next Legacy. You can find all the ways, including yourself, that shine on LinkedIn or on their one-pager. But I've always been a fan of the antithesis, right? It's what I call the anti-resume. I have one myself that literally highlights all my biggest failures and professional mistakes. So I'm curious, for you, what was a time you made a mistake, a bad professional decision in hindsight? One where you might have wished that either in the moment or thereafter, you had an Etch-a-Sketch to shake the board clean.
I mean, for me, so much of my career is a series of mistakes and failures. I never thought of it that way. I'm just an opportunistic, positive-minded person where I always see an opportunity to learn and do something new. But the truth is that there's, if you look at my resume, actually, it's a series of things. It's not one thing. If I were successful from the start, then I would have just been in one thing this whole time. So in some ways, the resume actually is the anti-resume. One of the earliest professional lessons that somebody's told me, you messed up. It was my first job. It was a consulting e-business, like an internet consulting business in 98. So kind of early days of tech. And we were serving a client. The client asked for some analysis, and I was the junior kid on the team. I did some analysis and I sent it back to the client right away. And my partner pulled me aside and said, great analysis, great initiative. Next time, wait a day. Because now that client thinks that whenever they ask a question, you're going to give them an answer, and a good one, in the next half hour. And it's just not the right, your action set communicated more than just doing the work. You actually set a pattern for the way you're going to interact with that client, and that actually is not that's not the kind of the pace of interaction that we want to set. So I just, that was like so over my head that I didn't contemplate the idea that my action had more. I was supposed to do my work. Oh, I should get a gold star for actually doing the work as fast as possible. And actually, as fast as possible isn't inherently the right way to do it. So that was a small early lesson. I realized there's more than just doing the tasks. But in venture, there's so many. We can cut this off, but there's so many things in venture where there's so many founders that I didn't invest in that I should have invested in. That's the entire business of venture. If you're doing it well, is you're meeting incredible founders, and there's so many founders that I should have invested in that I didn't dream enough. I didn't see it. Thankfully, I did see a few, and they worked out. But I don't think of them as failures, but there's a string of those where incredible founders where the timing wasn't right, or I didn't see it enough. I didn't invest, and they went on to be extremely successful. That's the fun of this business.
It is the fun, and there's a great line that a friend once told me in the world of LPs that where she said, "You don't have to invest in every good company, but every company you do invest in should be good." And so in the world of what we live in, we're going to miss a lot. We're going to make a lot of mistakes, but hopefully of the things we choose to get ourselves involved in, they're good opportunities. And so it may not mean being the fastest responder, because there are some times that could use, even just personally, a while longer to figure things out, because most decisions that you can make instantaneously are often emotionally driven, and sometimes you need to take the emotion out of the mix as well. And so that might be another qualifying factor to why you should probably take some time before you make a decision.
Yeah, wise words, David Joe. Wise words.
I'm honored. Ben, it has been such a pleasure. I've enjoyed every second of this. And of course, people can find you across all the socials and your email and all that. But is there a place that you would prefer people to reach out to you, whether it's queries from emerging LPs or just anyone else?
Yeah, Ben at nextlegacy.com. Email, I'm still kind of old school. Email is my to-do box. It's the way I manage my communications. Anything else works, but it gets lost.
I love it. I mean, I'm an email kind of, I had the opportunity to use Superhuman, and I did use it for a while, but I was such an email junkie from the very get-go before Superhuman came out that I over-optimized my email, and Superhuman just fell short of any expectation. I'm sorry to Rahul and the team there, but...
I was going to say, we got a lot of Superhuman fans around us, but I had the same experience. Yes.
All right, this is perfect. We could go on, and I may have killed my chances for Superhuman ever sponsoring this pod, but you got to be in good opportunities. I love Superhuman for everyone else. It's just for us, maybe we've over optimized our inbox already. Anyways, Ben, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with me on the show. I so appreciate it.
Super fun. Thanks a lot. Appreciate all the awesome questions and insights from you as well. Let's do it again. Okay, take care.
Hello, Superclusters fans. You've seen the logo at the beginning, and now we're here to address the elephant in the room. And the big question is, how intertwined is Superclusters and Alchemist Accelerator? And the truth is, Superclusters and Alchemist Accelerator are two completely separate entities, other than the fact that it is only I, David, your host, who is able to traverse between the multiverses. And so the reason Alchemist is a sponsor for Superclusters is the same reason why I ended up joining Alchemist. And it's for two reasons: the team and the product. So let me elaborate a little bit. For the team side, I was doing a bunch of diligence, homework, reference checks before I joined Alchemist, and I stumbled across a story which was between Ravi and an early team member of Alchemist. And for the sake of this story, I'm going to call that person John. So Ravi and John were working late at night because they had a deadline coming up, and as they were about to leave, Ravi found out that John didn't have a place to stay and had been sleeping out of his car the entire time. And the next thing Ravi did literally blew my mind, which was Ravi gave the keys to his place to John and said, "John, you're free to stay here for as long as you want." And I knew instantly that this is the team I wanted to join. This is the culture I wanted to be a part of. The second thing is the product itself. Alchemist has built this really robust product called the Vault, and it is the epitome of Peter Drucker's infamous line, which is, you cannot manage what you don't measure. And so for the uninitiated, what is Alchemist Accelerator? Alchemist Accelerator is your startup accelerator for companies that monetize from enterprises. And so don't take it just from me. We've backed incredible companies, including names you've heard of, LaunchDarkly, Prevacera, MoEngage, and we're also backed by some incredible LPs and investors, including Khosla Ventures, Mayfield, Salesforce. And now, between you and I can't share any of the numbers, and if I do, our compliance officer, will literally gobble me up for breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea, and dinner. And personally, I'm too young to die. But I will say, the numbers, they're great. Like, they're really great. And so if you're curious and want to get involved in Alchemist and the ecosystem, check out alchemistaccelerator.com/superclusters. And that's superclusters with an S at the beginning and at the S at the end. And we'll also include these links in the notes. Hey Superclusters fans, this is David from Post and want to share a few things before you go. If you're tuning in from the YouTube universe, and if you like this episode and if you want to see more of it, consider subscribing. It's free. Let us know down in the comments which LPs you'd want to see next, or topics you liked and want to hear more of. If you're tuning in from the audio universe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever content finds your ear, and you liked what you heard, give us a follow. And lastly, want to share a quick disclaimer from our legal friends. While I am the head of investor relations at Alchemist Accelerator, and that Alchemist Accelerator is one of our proud sponsors, the views expressed in this episode are for informational purposes only and are solely the views of myself and the guest alone. They are not representative of Alchemist Accelerator. None of the views expressed herein constitute legal, investment, business, or tax advice, and any allusions or references to funds or companies are purely for illustrative purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment recommendations. Consult a professional investment advisor near you prior to making any investment decisions. And that's all from me. See you on the next.